There is a moment that most people never talk about. A moment that happens in offices, in homes, in classrooms, in governments. It happens in the middle of a conversation, sometimes in the middle of a sentence. And in that moment, you feel it. Something tightens. Not in your chest, not in your throat, but somewhere deeper than that, somewhere the body keeps its oldest memories. You are looking at someone and you do not like them. Maybe you never liked them. Maybe there was a time you respected them, and that time has passed, like a season that ended without warning. But here you are. Nodding. Agreeing. Doing exactly what they asked. And the strangest part, the part that will haunt you later when you're alone and the lights are low, is that you don't fully understand why. You are not weak. You are not stupid. You are not the kind of person who gets pushed around. And yet, there you were. Obeying. This is not a story about weakness. This is a story about architecture. The invisible architecture that was built inside you long before you were old enough to question the blueprints. And today, on the Echo Principle, we are going to walk through every room of that structure. We are going to name what lives in the walls. And by the time we are done, you will never look at your own compliance the same way again. We spend a lot of time asking why people disobey. Why they rebel, why they resist, why they break the rules. Those are the stories we celebrate, the whistleblowers, the revolutionaries, the ones who said no when the entire world was saying yes. But almost nobody asks the more uncomfortable question. Why do we obey when every instinct in our body is telling us not to? That question, sitting quietly underneath decades of social psychology, is far more revealing. Because disobedience is the exception. Obedience, deep, persistent, almost automatic obedience, is the rule. Think about the last time you stayed silent in a meeting when you knew the decision being made was wrong. Think about the last time you laughed at something that wasn't funny because the person telling the joke had power over your paycheck. Think about the last time you performed enthusiasm for a directive you privately thought was idiotic. You didn't do those things because you were afraid, exactly. You did them because something in your social nervous system calculated the cost of resistance, weighed it against the discomfort of compliance, and made a choice, faster than conscious thought, deeper than rational decision-making. That calculation, that ancient unconscious ledger, is what we are here to examine. Because once you can see the machinery, you can begin to ask whether the machinery is still serving you, or whether you have become its servant. In 1961, a psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram set up what appeared to be a simple experiment about learning and memory. Participants were told they would be playing the role of a teacher. Across a partition, they could hear but not see another participant, who was playing the role of a student. Every time the student got an answer wrong, the teacher was instructed to administer an electric shock. And with every wrong answer, the voltage would increase. The switches on the machine were clearly labeled. 15 volts. 30 volts. Increasing steadily. All the way up to 450 volts. At that level, the label read simply, XXX. Now here is what you need to understand before we go any further. The shocks were not real. The student was an actor. The screams of pain were recorded. The entire setup was designed to measure one thing, and one thing only. How far would an ordinary person go if an authority figure in a lab coat simply told them to continue? Not ordered them. Not threatened them. Simply said, please continue. The experiment requires that you go on. Before the study began, Milgram asked psychiatrists to predict the results. They estimated that perhaps 1 to 3% of participants, the deeply disturbed ones, the sadistic edge cases, would go all the way to 450 volts. 65% did. 65%. 2 out of every 3 ordinary people, recruited from the street, people with jobs and families and moral convictions, continued delivering what they believed were potentially lethal electric shocks because a man in a white coat told them to. The psychiatric community was wrong by a factor of 20. And the reason they were wrong is the reason we are here today. Because they were measuring for sadism. They were measuring for cruelty. They were looking for the monster. But Milgram wasn't finding monsters. He was finding something far more disturbing. He was finding the perfectly normal, perfectly rational, perfectly human response to hierarchical authority. The participants in Milgram's experiment were not enjoying themselves. They were sweating. They were shaking. Several of them were crying. One man had a full seizure during the experiment. They were in genuine distress. But they continued. And when researchers asked them afterward why they kept going, even when the students stopped responding entirely, the answers were remarkably consistent. He told me to continue. It was part of the experiment. I assumed he knew what he was doing. I didn't want to ruin the study. It wasn't my responsibility. That last phrase, "it wasn't my responsibility," is one of the most important sentences in the history of psychology. Because it reveals the central mechanism of obedience to authority. The transfer of moral agency. When we enter a hierarchical structure, and make no mistake, we are always inside at least one, something remarkable happens to our sense of responsibility. It doesn't disappear. It migrates. Milgram called this the agentic state. The shift from seeing yourself as an autonomous individual making free choices to seeing yourself as an instrument of someone else's will. In the agentic state, you are still capable of feeling discomfort. You can still recognize that something seems wrong. But the ownership of the wrongness, the moral weight of the action, has been transferred upward. To the person giving the orders. To the institution. To the system. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. This is a deeply functional social adaptation. Human beings are the most cooperative species on the planet. We built civilizations because we could divide labor, follow instruction, and defer to designated expertise. Without the agentic state, you would not have surgeons who can operate under a chief's direction, soldiers who can hold a line under a general's command, or factories that can produce anything at scale. The agentic state is the engine of organized society. The problem, the dark and terrible problem, is that this same engine runs equally well when the hierarchy is corrupt. When the authority is incompetent. When the person at the top of the chain is not wise or just, but simply louder, or older, or wearing the right kind of clothes. The machinery does not check for virtue. It only checks for position. Let's bring this out of the laboratory and into your life. Think about the hierarchy you inhabit most regularly. Your workplace. Your family structure. The social group you have been part of the longest. Now think about the person in that hierarchy whose authority you follow, but whose judgment you privately distrust. The manager who got promoted because they were there the longest, not because they were the best. The parent whose approval you still seek, even though you have been an adult for a decade. The team leader who takes credit for work they didn't do, and whose decisions you watch fail in slow motion, quarter after quarter. You know who I'm talking about. You felt something shift in your chest when I described them. Now ask yourself honestly, how often do you comply with their direction, not because you believe it's right, but because the machinery of the hierarchy has made compliance feel like the path of least resistance? Not least pain. Least resistance. Those are different things. Compliance in a corrupt hierarchy is not painless. It costs you something every single time. A small piece of your self-concept. A quiet erosion of the boundary between who you are and who the structure requires you to be. Milgram saw this in his participants. Afterward, many of them struggled with what they had done. Not because they were cruel, but because they had discovered something about themselves that didn't match their self-image. They had followed orders. and the orders had led somewhere dark. Now let us scale this up. Let us move from the office and the family dinner table to the most extreme case study of hierarchical obedience that modern history has to offer. Because if you want to understand the architecture of compliance at its most engineered, its most deliberate, its most weaponized, you study the cult. Not because cults are exotic. Not because they happen to other people, less intelligent people, more gullible people. But precisely because they don't. The psychological profile of the average cult recruit is not what you expect. Research consistently shows that cult members tend to be above average in intelligence, highly idealistic, and going through a period of transition or uncertainty at the time of recruitment. They are searching for meaning. They are open to new frameworks. They are, in the most literal sense, exactly the kind of deep thinker who watches channels like this one. The manipulation begins not with demands, but with belonging. The first thing a high-control group offers is not doctrine. It is community. Warmth. The feeling of being finally, completely understood. This is called love bombing. And it is devastatingly effective because it exploits one of the most fundamental human needs, the need to be seen. Once belonging has been established, the doctrine can be introduced gradually, incrementally, through a process so slow that no single step feels like a step at all. Each small commitment makes the next slightly larger commitment feel reasonable. This is the foot-in-the-door technique, scaled to an ideology. Without naming a specific individual, let us examine the psychological toolkit that appears consistently across high-control group leaders throughout the 20th and 21st century. Because the patterns are not random. They are almost identical. Which tells us something profound: this is not genius at work. This is exploitation of the same cognitive vulnerabilities, discovered independently, again and again. The first tool is information control. The leader does not initially forbid outside information. They simply reframe it. Outside sources become unreliable. Skeptics become enemies. Doubt itself becomes a moral failure. You are not being forbidden to read the newspaper, you are being taught that reading the newspaper means you have not yet fully committed to the truth. The second tool is identity replacement. Slowly, the recruit's previous identity, their career, their relationships, their hobbies, their sense of humor, is reframed as the old self. The person they were before is presented as lost, confused, incomplete. The group offers a new identity, cleaner, more purposeful, more chosen. And because the new identity feels better, at least initially, the recruit embraces it. The third tool is social proof through isolation. As outside relationships atrophy, the recruit becomes more dependent on the group for social validation. The group becomes the only mirror. And when the only mirror available reflects back a specific image of who you are and what you owe, the reflection begins to feel like reality. This is the question that sits at the center of every conversation about cults, about toxic relationships, about abusive workplaces. Why don't they just leave? And I want to be very precise about why that question, framed that way, fundamentally misunderstands the psychology at work. Leaving is not a decision. Leaving is an identity reconstruction. By the time someone is deeply embedded in a high-control system, their sense of self has been restructured around their role within it. Leaving doesn't just mean walking out a door. It means dismantling the entire architecture of meaning that has been built around them. It means becoming, in a very real psychological sense, nobody. At least temporarily. And the human mind will endure enormous external suffering in order to avoid that internal void. This is not weakness. This is the mind doing exactly what it evolved to do, protecting the coherence of the self at almost any cost. Leon Festinger, one of the great social psychologists of the 20th century, described a related phenomenon called cognitive dissonance. The discomfort we experience when our actions and our beliefs are misaligned. And the extraordinary lengths the mind will go to in order to resolve that dissonance, not by changing the behavior, but by rewriting the belief. If I am still here, then being here must be right. If I am still obeying, then the person I am obeying must deserve it. The mind will construct almost any narrative to avoid the alternative. We have traveled a significant distance in this conversation. From a laboratory in New Haven, to the architecture of high control groups, to the neurological mechanisms of compliance. And now I want to bring us all the way home. Because everything we have discussed, the agentic state, the transfer of moral responsibility, the gradual escalation of commitment, the identity restructuring, the cognitive dissonance, none of it is exclusive to experiments or cults. It is the water you swim in every single day. The workplace that slowly taught you that your instincts were wrong and the manager's instincts were right. The relationship that gradually made your preferences seem selfish and their preferences seem like common sense. The family system that assigned you a role before you were old enough to audition for a different one and has been reinforcing that casting ever since. These are not dramatic examples. They are not edge cases. They are Tuesday. The question is not whether you exist inside hierarchical structures that shape your behavior. You do. Everyone does. The question is whether you can see the structure clearly enough to make a conscious choice about how much of yourself you are willing to offer it. Milgram's participants didn't fail because they were bad people. They failed, if we can even call it failure, because no one had ever shown them the machinery. No one had ever said, look, here is what is happening inside you right now. Here is the name of the mechanism that is making the voltage feel necessary. We are saying it now. Let us go one level deeper. Because this is the echo principle, and we do not stop at the behavioral surface. We go all the way down to the substrate. Research in social neuroscience over the last 2 decades has revealed something genuinely remarkable about how the brain processes hierarchical information. Hierarchy is not just a social construct that exists outside the body. It is encoded inside it. The brain has dedicated neural circuitry for tracking social rank. Studies using functional MRI have shown that when we are in the presence of someone we perceive as higher status, specific regions of the prefrontal cortex reduce their activity. The regions responsible for independent judgment, critical evaluation, and self-referential thought. In plain language, high-status individuals literally suppress the part of your brain that questions them. This is not a metaphor. This is measurable, reproducible neuroscience. The mechanism appears to be tied to cortisol and serotonin regulation. Lower-status individuals in a hierarchy show elevated cortisol levels, the stress hormone, and suppressed serotonin. Higher-status individuals show the reverse. And these neurochemical states directly influence cognitive function. Stress narrows attention. It reduces working memory capacity. It makes complex, multi-step reasoning harder, and fast, automatic, rule-following behavior easier. So the experience of being low in a hierarchy is not just psychologically uncomfortable. It is neurologically impairing. The system is designed, at the biological level, to make compliance easier than resistance. So where does this leave us? We have established that obedience to hierarchy is not a character flaw. It is a biological inheritance, refined over hundreds of thousands of years of social evolution. We have established that the mechanisms of compliance are so deeply wired that they persist even in the face of obvious harm, obvious injustice, and obvious personal cost. We have looked at the laboratory, the cult, the office, and the nervous system. And the picture that emerges is sobering. But it is not hopeless. And here is why. Milgram conducted a variation of his original experiment. In this version, rather than being alone with the authority figure, the participant was placed with 2 other people who refused to continue administering shocks. Who said, clearly and without drama, I'm not going to do this anymore. The compliance rate dropped from 65% to 10%. 10%. The simple presence of dissent, not argument, not protest, just someone else quietly refusing, was enough to break the agentic state for the vast majority of participants. What this tells us is both humbling and extraordinary. We are deeply, profoundly social creatures. The same social wiring that makes us vulnerable to hierarchy also makes us responsive to each other. One person who can see the machinery clearly enough to name it changes the calculation for everyone in the room. This is why awareness is not passive. This is why understanding the architecture of your own compliance is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is an act of quiet, structural resistance. Every system of control, from the most intimate to the most institutional, depends on one thing above all else: your inability to see it. The moment you can name the mechanism, the moment you can feel the agentic state settling over you and recognize it for what it is, not reality, not necessity, not who you are, but a psychological weather system, passing through, the moment that happens, something fundamental shifts. You do not have to dramatically rebel. You do not have to quit the job, leave the relationship, or give the speech. Sometimes the most important act of resistance is simply internal. A quiet refusal to let the transfer of moral agency go unnoticed. A decision to remain, even slightly, the author of your own reasoning. The chains that hold most people are not made of iron. They are made of something far more durable, the unexamined assumption that the hierarchy deserves what you are giving it. Examine it. That is the only instruction. Not a revolution. Just a look. A clear, honest, unflinching look at the structures that shape your choices, and a simple question directed at each one. Is this mine? Or is this the echo of something I was handed before I knew I had a choice? This has been the echo principle. We map the unseen blueprints of human behavior, not to paralyze you with complexity, but to return to you something that was always yours. Your own mind. We'll see you in the next one.